In the next year, Ukraine commemorates the 90th anniversary of the Holodomor genocide. It comes at a time when Ukraine is facing a new struggle for its survival. Russia is committing a new genocide with the full-scale war it launched in February 2022. Methods to suppress Ukrainian nationhood differ. A man-made famine, terror, and deportation in the 1930s, and war in the 21st century. But the intent remains the same, and the source of this misery is Russia once more. But the Ukrainian nation perseveres, and Ukrainians themselves seem to be irrepressible, resilient, inventive, and indomitable. Welcome to Silicon Curtain Podcast. If you enjoy the material we create, then please do like and subscribe to help boost the popularity of our videos, and especially bring attention to our fantastic speakers. Bohdan Krawchenko is a senior research fellow in Graduate School of Development at the University of Central Asia, based in Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan. He is also advisor to the rector and a director. Welcome to the channel.
Thank you.
Well, first, let me ask a few questions, because how I became aware of you really was through articles you've written and some activities that we'll talk about in a minute, in terms of the very first monument that was created to this incredible and terrible tragedy. But first, can you give me a little bit about your background and these writings you've done on the Holodomor?
Well, I was born and raised. I was raised in Quebec, and I did university in Canada. And then I went to Britain and did a doctorate at Oxford at St. Anthony's College, and came back to Canada. And I worked in Edmonton for the newly established Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. And that's how I got involved in writing and researching about Ukraine. I wrote a book and all sorts of things about Ukraine. And in 1991, in January, before independence, I moved to Ukraine on a sabbatical leave. And I became the director of the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies. And it was during that period that I got involved. I was heavily involved with the community, and during the 50th anniversary in 1983, we organized we organized events and the opening of a monument, very contemporary style monument in memory of the victims of Holodomor in the public space. And this was the first time that there was a monument in a public space. It was in front of City Hall. It had to be approved by City Hall, and it was opened by the Premier of Alberta. And this is in 1883, and this was the beginning of public recognition of Holodomor. And then in 91, when I moved to Ukraine to do a sabbatical, to do some more research, but Ukraine was on the verge of independence, and as it happened, I met people and got involved in policy and with the government, and I ended up being the founding director of the Institute of Public Administration of the Cabinet of Ministers, which was later the Academy of Public Administrations. I did that for 12, 13 years. As a break, I thought after the Orange Revolution, I would come here for a couple of years and come back to Ukraine. But it turns out that I also became the Director General of the University of Central Asia, the Dean of the Graduate School, and I'm now on my way out. And I have these wonderful titles where I can do research and give advice and not really take responsibility for anything. It's a great job.
And coming back to the monument, I mean, that's the first one in the world to recognize it. We'll talk a little bit about the suppression of this event in the Soviet Union. But I think something that's come through incredibly clearly in the current struggle is that monuments like this have an incredible relevance now. I don't know how many of our audience saw it, but there was a beautiful monument to the Holodomor in territories occupied by Russian forces, and they defiled and destroyed that monument quite deliberately. So monuments aren't just something about a passive events in the past. They're incredibly sort of active and meaningful in the present, aren't they?
They are, and there's a great French journal which is called Lieu de Mémoire, places of memory. Monuments are places of memory, and people study these places of memory. They're very, very significant. And to destroy these places of memory is to try to destroy historical memory. And that is a barbaric act on behalf of Russians, and actually a recognition that Ukrainians are different.
And of course, Russian propaganda makes a really big play of this in the removal of Soviet-era monuments. Now, in many countries, I mean, maybe not so much in the Baltics, where they're being sort of blown up and shoved into rivers, but in some countries they're put into parks. And I know around Ukraine, not all the monuments during the Soviet period were eliminated, but they were put in sort of special places where they could be seen, perhaps put in some kind of context with additional historical information. But Russian propaganda makes a big play of monuments on their side, don't they? But again, monuments mean different things for different people. So Soviet-era monuments now very clearly are coming to represent oppression, Soviet control in the territories of, say, Ukraine, the Baltics, Poland, and so on.
In Ukraine, it's not just the Soviet period, which obviously you can't have monuments to the Stalinist period and to absolute monsters that were responsible for thousands of lives, millions of lives. But in Ukraine, it's also dismantling the Russian imperial monuments. A very important decision was recently made in Odessa by the city council to remove the statue of Catherine the Great, so-called. And it's not going to be destroyed. It's going to probably be put in the park of totalitarian, the monuments of the totalitarian part. But Catherine II's removal of monument is very, very important. And one of the reasons given is because Catherine destroyed Ukrainian, the Cossack state autonomy, and she reintroduced serfdom in Ukraine when it was largely shattered through the uprising of 1648 by Bohdan Khmelnytsky, which was a huge peasant rebellion. So after not having serfdom in its, there were obviously still oppression, so peasants were still oppressed, but you didn't have serfdom. To actually have a monument to the person that destroyed Ukrainian autonomy and reintroduce serfdom is amazing. And and she's a big hero, of course, for the Russians. But this is part of cleansing of Ukrainian memory, because what she did was the beginning of a kind of approach that Russia had to Ukraine, that was the breadbasket of Europe, that was an agricultural El Dorado, and had to be exploited. So the serfdom that was introduced in Ukraine was much worse than the serfdom that existed in Russia, which was quit rent, where you paid a certain proportion of your income in kind or in money. But in Ukraine, it was in the delivery of labor. So although precisely because Ukraine was a rich agricultural land, the peasants had very little land because it was so productive that the Russian landowners wanted as much land as possible. And in the absence of agricultural equipment, they needed the labor of Ukrainian peasants. And so you had a very particularly brutal type of serfdom that claimed labor time and did not allow you to leave the land. So here you have a people sitting on the best land in Europe, very productive, and being stripped of the fruits of their labor.
And that's something we were talking about before, because when I studied this period, back at school, it was always put purely in the context of industrialization, collectivization. And we'll come to the details in a minute, because not everyone will be aware of, what actually happened in the 1920s. But I think what you're saying is that the roots of the Holodomor and the Soviet policies of requisitioning grain, etc., livestock, they have much, much deeper roots than just the Soviet system and the 1920s.
Yes, because there was a dominant imperial view at that time of Ukraine as an agricultural El Dorado to be exploited. And don't forget that during the 1917 revolution, not, it's not the Bolsheviks that did it. During the 1917 Ukrainian National Revolution, a huge, the majority, the biggest component of that was the agrarian revolution. So by the time that the Bolsheviks came and occupied Ukraine, land had been seized from the landlords, and the peasants obtained their age-old dream of owning land. And when the Bolsheviks came in on their third attempt, what did they do? They introduced collective farms, taking land away from the peasants. They fought a revolution to get this land. And now they were driven back into collective farms. Well, that collectivization was a disaster. It led to massive uprisings in Ukraine that were put down. As Frunze said, this is an amazing situation where Moscow can sleep quiet, and and in Ukraine there's constant fighting because there was huge resistance to it until the new economic policy came in, NEP, which dismantled collectivization, and of course introduced private ownership. Ukraine was doing extremely well during the 1920s. In fact, Ukrainians had probably, as I recall, one of the highest birth rates in the world because of the newly found prosperity of land and economic growth.
I mean, for those who don't know the history, and this is very hazy because I'm recalling it from many years ago. Wasn't that introduced in 1924 by Lenin to try and turn around the economy, which had been trashed after the Civil War?
21.
21. Sorry, yes.
Yeah.
And that lasted until, was it 27? Or?
Well, it lasted 27, 28, 29, because with industrialization, you had the confiscation of private property, and especially the big enterprises had been nationalized in any case, but it was the abolition of private property by a growing class of sort of middle business that the Bolsheviks considered to be a threat because they couldn't extract a surplus from it, and collectivization because they couldn't extract a huge surplus in order to industrialize. And industrialization was done hastily and was very, very wasteful. It was unbelievably wasteful, and everybody knew at that time. In order to pay for it, you had to you had to extract grain and then sell it abroad, and they're selling it abroad during the Depression when the prices were low. But that industrialization was produced a very distorted economy, very heavily focused on heavy industry, no technological breakthroughs of any kind, and it laid the foundation of a non-viable economy that resulted in the collapse of the Soviet Union. 60 years later, the Soviet Union simply imploded because of the economic failures of it. That began with industrialization, which was a command economy that had no ability to judge quality, excessive waste, and that required more and more resources because waste was one of the dominant features of that economy.
And what are the characteristics of that waste? Because we see in Russia's current invasion as well, we see the extraordinary effect of poor planning, poor strategy, poor equipment, massive corruption, endemic nepotism, poor quality of goods as well, poor quality of their supplies. Are these the similar kind of problems that plagued industrialization?
If you're going to build plants by and try to do this in a couple of years, and you don't have any kind of serious thinking about technology, you have no way to measure quality because there's no market where there is you can find out what the demand for these things are, and you can actually get an estimation of costs. If there is no market, you can't put a price on what things are. So you're building these factories very rapidly, and first of all, you're making huge mistakes, but also they are producing products that are defective. And during industrialization, there was case after case where 40% of the factory's outputs were defective. And since you don't have any kind of financial plan to meet, you can sequester whatever resources you want. You can build factories in the most wasteful, inefficient way, make huge mistakes. If something goes wrong, you tear down half the factory and you start again because you have an unlimited supply of material. Who's paying for that material? Some of which, well, a good part of it was imported. The Ukrainian peasants whose bread was sequestered so that they can order equipment. It was a yeah.
And NEP, when it was introduced, because again, people might not know exactly what that is. So the new economic policy was a kind of free market that was introduced by Lenin, wasn't it? And that quite rapidly got not just industry back on its feet, but did it resurrect sort of a kind of market economy in the countryside? Did people able to sell their surplus and so on?
Well, absolutely. Its very big impact was in the countryside where people owned the land, and I mean, I can just think of my grandfather. He owned land. He became very inventive. They collectively, the village council collectively established a mill to grind to make flour, added value in the villages. Nourishment was very, very good, which was responsible for low death rates and very high birth rates. So the countryside produced surpluses, and the cities were very well fed. And what happened was also you saw what we would call the growth of small and medium business. The retail sector was privatized, shops were open. You didn't have anything like what happened later on, which is shortages of shirts and all of this kind of stuff. Because of a free market, it could respond to demand. So if shirt red size 40 sold extremely well, you made more shirts size 40. But if you plan ahead under central planning that you are going to make X quantity of shirts red, you either create too many or you do too few, because you can't estimate demand. It's not driven by demand. It's driven by indicators that the planners set. And that's the reason why the Soviets had a colossal deficit of goods. And there was no innovation. This is a country that could not produce a ballpoint pen because that was too complicated. You can produce tanks, but it could not produce a rimless tire because that was too precision engineering. No attention was paid to the consumer side. It was all went into heavy industry that did machines to produce heavy industry and armaments. I mean, it was a totally militarized society. And whatever technology was available, don't forget that in Ukraine and in Russia, they had all the plans to make computers. They had done the engineering and the science, but nothing ever happened. There's a great book done by an MIT historian of science in the USSR called Dead Ideas. It's amazing how many good ideas there were, but it never found any consequence in society.
And I always wondered, and this is quite sort of speculative, if there had been MEP-style reforms in the 1950s under Khrushchev, rather than waiting another sort of 30, 40 years for Gorbachev, when really it was too late. And the idea of the Homo Sovieticus had really been kind of entrenched in people's psyches. If these reforms had happened in the 1950s, you would have had a generation of people who still had a connection, who would have remembered in some ways the economic system and life prior to the revolution. There would have been an older generation still with that direct connection. My question really is, Ukraine seems to have preserved more of that connection to its pre-revolutionary character than perhaps Russia has. Is that a correct idea, or how do you explain how
Oh,
Ukraine is so resilient?
I think that's very correct. And we're now, because there's a real confrontation with Russia and Ruski Mir and the Russian world, people begin to realize how different Ukrainians are. I was in the Soviet Union in the 70s. There was a vast difference between a Ukrainian village and a Russian village. All you had to do was to cross the border. The Ukrainian villages were clean. They weren't, particularly luxurious, but they were clean, and there was whatever livestock and gardens and this sort of thing. You crossed over into the Russian side, and the villages were not well kept. None of that hard work on cultivating vegetables and taking care of livestock. And the Russian countryside today is a disaster. So the Ukrainians always were that kind, very closely tied to the land and very hard working. And we now begin to realize how different we are because of the confrontation with Russia. It has sharpened our sense of distinctiveness.
And memories of the Holodomor, and obviously studying it under the Soviet Union was not possible. It was suppressed. So
Yeah.
who and how did the memories of the Holodomor get passed on? Because I know, people in Canada and around the world, the diaspora were very important in actually continuing
Yeah.
that memory.
Well, the Holodomor was never. You couldn't talk about the famine. You couldn't talk about the colossal repressions, the purges. Don't forget that in the same period, 80% of Ukraine's intelligentsia were decimated. 80%. Now, name a country that loses 80% of its intellectuals. I mean, you're killing off the mind. Every bishops of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and thousands of priests were executed. So, that all comes together. Um, so it was impossible to talk about that. And of course, and people would not talk about this in Ukraine to their children for fear that their children are going to go to school and blab about this. So there was this incredible tragedy, and there were individual accounts of it of people, but it was never articulated into the bigger picture. So I mean, I had my relatives in Dnipro. Originally, our family is from the east, so relatives in Dnipropetrovsk, in Kharkiv, in Donetsk Oblast. Of course, they knew about individually. They knew about the Holodomor, but they didn't get the bigger picture because no one could articulate that. And you couldn't do that until Gorbachev's perestroika happened, and even that just began. So what happened is the West took a role in large part because the children of the immigrants who came to Canada, who were from Eastern Ukraine, our parents could not articulate, could not give voice to their experience of the famine because they didn't have the capacity to do that. They didn't know languages, they didn't know research. So it was my generation who could actually give voice to what our parents went through and put it in the framework. And so at the Canadian, and there were institutions that began to do this. So at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, at the Harvard Institute of Ukrainian Studies, the initial work on Holodomor started. And then of course, and it was continued by people like James Mace, Robert Conquest, and then later Timothy Snyder and Applebaum. I mean, they made a huge contribution to this. And then in Ukraine, it picked up with the Institute of Memory, looked at the archives. Lots of interesting books were written, lots of interesting reports about party meetings. I mean, it's extremely rich archival material that is actually mind-boggling when you begin to realize the cynicism that was involved, and that this was cruelty planned in detail. It wasn't just, okay, we're going to be in general. They went into the details of how to be cruel. So that was increasingly part of the reconstruction of Ukrainian memory, which was ripped apart by the discontinuity of statehood and the discontinuity of intellectual traditions. The intellectuals of the 1920s, those that went through the revolution, were executed in the 1930s. And then fortunately Western Ukraine became part of Ukraine, and they had a freer environment in the interwar period, and they had some intellectuals and some ideas, but it took quite an effort. And when all is said and done, when you look at what Ukraine went through during the famine, and then the colossal losses during the Second World War. When anybody calls this war of Russian glory, it was Ukraine that was occupied entirely, where troops swept across Ukraine 4 times, going in, going out, attacking, withdrawing. When all of that is said and done, 2/3 of Ukraine's male population by the 50s had died, and 1/4 of the female population. These are catastrophic losses. And it's a miracle Ukrainians survived. But they did to live and fight another day.
So those losses, does that include the Holodomor, the Civil War, the Revolution, or are those numbers even greater?
Yes, that includes that. And also, I mean, one forgets huge losses during the Second World War. Massive losses. The Ukrainian front was the major front. And Ukrainian troops played a colossal role. The Ukrainian front played a colossal role during the Second World War.
And that comes with villages as well, doesn't it? It comes with entire villages, cities being erased, and entire material culture disappearing, because it was incredibly brutal fighting, wasn't it, on the territory of Ukraine?
It was incredibly brutal fighting. And when the Soviets were retreating, they blew up things. When the Germans were retreating, they blew up things. So, I mean, so much of of course, and during the 1930s, the Russians began to blow up every Ukrainian church they could find. Do you know that Saint Sophia was supposed to be blown up? And it was only stopped through the intervention of this French communist writer who begged it not to be blown up in order to create the biggest square in Europe for parading of the troops. And if you go to St. Sophia Square and you see this kind of very big Soviet building, which is now the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, that was the first part of a whole range of buildings all around the square. And St. Sophia, this jewel, over 1,000-year-old jewel, was going to be blown up to do marching, and of course the other church next to it was blown up and had to be was reconstructed. That too was a church that was about 200 years older than St. Sophia. And this was a rapacious destruction of Ukrainian historical monuments.
And some of the figures that you shared with me before we spoke, just, I hadn't been aware of just the sheer brutality of it. So obviously the peasant population and the huge numbers involved are very difficult to humanize that. But one of the figures you shared here is that there was actually resistance from Ukrainian officials, intellectuals, teachers during the Holodomor. Voices were raised to try to get Moscow to be realistic and to stop its requisition of grain that was causing the famine.
Yeah.
But the result of that resistance, I think you wrote, is that eventually the entire parliament, every single deputy and every single politician on the Council of People's Commissars was eventually shot. Not just a
Yes.
few, but every single one.
Well, yes, because the Ukrainian, first of all, the fact that there was a Ukrainian Communist Party was a concession to the Ukrainian Revolution, and the fact that there were Ukrainians in the Communist Party who wanted to see Ukraine. Ukraine, by the way, was supposed to be an independent state, and it was part of the. It was an element of the the constitution of this of this association, this union of republics. And they then said, well, since we have formally a union of republics, then we have to have decentralized communist parties. So therefore, the Ukrainian Communist Party should not answer to the party in Moscow, but we should answer to the Communist International. And the Russian party can answer to the, well, of course, the Russian Communist Party thought this was a terrible idea. So this element of Ukrainian national communism was actually quite strong in the party, because they were surrounded by people and there was colossal pressure and they wanted it. They really did think that there could be sort of a communist idea with Ukrainian, which incorporated Ukrainian national ambitions was possible. Well, they were absolutely brutally killed. The purges were horrific. And that continued into the Soviet period. The majority of political prisoners in the Soviet Union were from Ukraine. I forget who it was who said that if in Russia they clip your nails when you're a dissident, in Ukraine they cut your hand off. It was there was overkill and over suppression of Ukrainian dissidents. Ukraine did not, demographically, Ukraine was about almost 20% of the population of the USSR. It didn't have to be 60% of political prisoners.
And there's an extraordinary parallel, isn't there? When you describe that, the idea is that if you had a Ukraine that's part of the Soviet Union, but is perhaps developing a different flavor of socialism, maybe even a more successful one, there's a real contrast to now, isn't there? Because one of the reasons I believe Putin invaded Ukraine is because he couldn't stand there being, an ex-Soviet state, a Slavic nation that was more successful, that provided a template for perhaps Russian citizens to look at and rebel. There's an extraordinary parallel here, isn't there? That Russia couldn't have another competing system, even possibly a more successful one.
Well, yes, I mean, an authoritarian imperial state that wants to dominate you cannot possibly tolerate you, because you have a relatively democratic society where people can articulate their dreams and their identities and build a state that they want to be comfortable with. And don't forget, Ukraine changed presidents. Russia didn't. Ukraine had, elections. We had problems, but then again, we had revolutions to kick out people. We kicked out Kuchma and then we kicked out Yanukovych. So, that's a pretty good record. That would never happen. I mean, to in Russia, and that was Putin's nightmare. What a bloody example these people are setting. Constantly having these open societies and this sort of thing. I think Ukraine could have and will become a very successful state, because it will have the social foundations for economic growth and the social foundations for democracy. And the growth of the Ukrainian IT sector, that according to global competitiveness and all that, is like ranked fourth in Europe. Even during the war, the IT sector has grown by 60%, billions of dollars. And one of the reasons why the IT sector is successful, because the idiots in government couldn't figure out how to regulate it. It's the same thing happened in India. By the time the Raj woke up to administer it, it was too late. You had Infosys, Wipro, and all of that. The same thing happened in Ukraine. And there is this energy and drive in Ukrainian society. The fact that Ukrainians have Schengen visas, they can freely visit Europe. I mean, it has had a colossal influence. So you have this dynamic society, this cultural growth, this growth of national identity, this growth of an identity that is founded in democratic ideas. The rise of a political nation that thinks democratic rights is the cement that holds our national identity together. That's what makes us different. And then you have the Russian imperial idea. I remember idiots from Russia wearing T-shirts in Istanbul. You don't have to like us; you have to be afraid of us. Jeez, what a great message!
I mean, that sums it up, though, doesn't it?
That sums it up. I mean, this is a very attractive proposition for the rest of the world.
And by regulate, what you really mean, isn't it, is the apparatchiks coming in and the oligarchs coming in and stealing it. I mean, that's what you really mean by regulation.
Well, you tend to do regulations not for the benefit in our part of the world. You do regulate. Otherwise, you'd have to clamp down on the environment and pollution and all of that. Of course, and corruption was a big problem and is a big problem in Ukraine. But what Ukraine did not have, and this is a very significant difference, it did not have the same small number of oligarchs that Russia did, where about 150 families control about 75 or something like that of the national wealth. I mean, it's an incredible concentration of wealth because Ukraine doesn't have petrochemicals, hydrocarbons. It's not one pipe. So one of our billionaires made money selling chocolates. Okay, that's a bit different.
Poroshenko, yeah.
Poroshenko. I mean, that's a bit of a difference than taking over, kicking somebody else on a gas license and doing this. So from that point of view, Ukraine is not is a fairly decentralized country. There are many towns that are almost equal to the capital. And it's a society that is very horizontally organized. There were quite a number of rich people, but no one who is overpowering. And if you are overpowering, you get into trouble. I mean, Ukraine now has anti-oligarch laws. So if you're super rich, you can't have media. This is, and this is supported. If you look at opinion polls about what the Ukrainian population thinks are priorities, next to winning the war, it's fighting corruption. And there's going to be a huge impetus for that after the war, because the people who suffered for all of this are not going to come back and to allow these guys to carry on the way they have carried on in the past. So, I mean, there's always been this pressure, but it's going to grow.
And that leads me to sort of two questions there, and I'll fire both questions at once. I mean, one is, of course, the media landscape, and I've talked to a couple of people about this. And of course, as you say, prior to the full-scale war and the centralization of the media apparatus, one of the main features of the media had been, first of all, that revolutionary impulse from Maidan. But the other feature of Ukrainian media had been this continuous, battle between sort of different oligarch-owned media enterprises, which, of course, now is being tackled. The other one, of course, is that I think what the world has woken up and realized is that Russian oligarchs are not really oligarchs. They don't own the money that they live. They don't own the lifestyle. They're leasing the lifestyle from the state. And if they so far as step outside of the script, it becomes immediately apparent that their wealth is just a bauble, not a genuine thing. So Ukrainian oligarchs, for good or bad, were genuine oligarchs. Russian ones were not.
Well, this happened under Putin in particular, where the heads of the various influential people of the security services became heads of corporations. If you want to kill an economy, just go out and put your security agents as CEOs of companies. They'll do it for you, And so what you have is not, you're very right to say this, because the people who were sort of market driven, and market driven oligarchs trying to aim for monopoly and all of this kind of stuff, but they were individual owners. It's been replaced by a state capitalist thing, and where there's absolutely no innovation. So that's very different in Ukraine. That structure.
Let's turn back to the Holodomor, because I'm aware that we haven't sort of covered it historically or chronologically. I mean,
Yeah.
for our users or our audience who really want to sort of read up more about this or understand the sequence of events, could you give a bit of a description from the
So what?
NEP through to the
Yeah.
end?
So what began was, you have to extract surplus from the peasantry. You can either do this through market mechanisms, where the people will do well, but the state may not have it's not going to be in the hands of a centralized power. It's going to be economic development through the development of consumers and this kind of stuff. Although and also you could do industrialization in a more rational way. So in other words, you need collectivization. So since the peasants don't want to go into collectivization, what it began is with the expropriation and the deportation. I know my grandparents and my father was victims of this, where they came in, and allegedly these were the wealthy peasants. It wasn't the wealthy peasants. It was the more hardworking peasants, because land was fairly equally distributed, but also those who were opinion leaders in the villages. So my grandfather, for example, when they started raising taxes in the 1920s on the villages, he said, "Okay, we're ready to pay taxes, but can we have a school, a better school?" So the wealthiest Ukrainian peasant generally earned less than a worker in industry. So that gives you some scale of this. I mean, workers in industry were paid better than so-called kulak. So you have to eliminate the organizing core of village life. Those who had ideas on the own, those who were active in village councils, and you had to deport them. And so hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian peasants were rounded up, put on cattle carts. In the case of my father and his family, they were deported and dropped off in the woods in northern Russia, outside of Vologda, where there was such a high mortality of children that eventually they had to let the children go, because entire families were deported and they were simply dying. And so that was the first thing. You chop off the head. You chop off the head of the organizing core of the village, and then you begin collectivization. But collectivization means that I take over I take over your property, and you now are working for a collective. But this collectivization it did not involve any kind of investments. So it wasn't the case where, okay, I have an inducement to join the collective farm because they have machinery, they will raise agricultural productivity, and I'm going to get paid. I was forced into collective farms and got a parcel of land so I don't starve. But even that was, the produce was taken and I wasn't paid. And so that meant that you had a fantastic instrument for the exploitation of the peasantry. And so then it's already collectivized. Agriculture is a complete mess. Ukrainian peasants resisted. Agriculture collectivization did not at this stage add any new technology or value added to agriculture, but it was a great sequester of surplus. So you begin to take the surplus away and you impose grain quotas. And since the peasants are not going to surrender their last morsel, you begin to raid. you begin to raid villages, and you take as much grain as you possibly can, so that they have virtually nothing left to feed themselves. And the sequestration was so high that they even took the grain that you needed in order to sow the next crop. So all of this continues. This is in 1930, 31, 32, and 32, there you have a huge crisis where there's not enough food to feed the peasants because it has been sequestered. You're not allowed to leave the land. You're not allowed to leave collective farms. Ukrainian peasants are hungry and dying. They're not allowed to cross the border. They are there's no attempt to help them, and they die agonizing deaths. Death by famine is the most agonizing death you can conceivably have. It's I mean I quote people who live through this is, on the front you're fighting, you have a chance, you get a bullet, but this is, you're in your own home with your family and you're withering away, and there's nothing you can do because you've eaten every root there is to have, every morsel of bread, and you just die a slow, agonizing, lonely death. And there were millions who died like that. And then, of course, what is paradoxical, that the famine ended in 1934, although that was a year when there was actually a bad harvest. That was worse than previous years. But but grain stocks were released, and there was no famine. So this is a remarkable. This is really quite. This is an event where the people who produced agricultural products, the people who were the breadbasket of Europe, were stripped of their food and starved. Not because there wasn't food around, because it was taken away from them. And then
Precisely. It happened
it,
in a
it,
year
it's
of high yields as well. It didn't
yeah,
happen in a disastrous
yeah.
harvest.
This is not because there was a failure of crops. It's because crops were taken away. So it's a bit different from the potato famine in Ireland, where there was a failure, and of course nobody cared about the Irish peasants. But here there wasn't a failure. This was simply that we took all your potatoes away.
The question then becomes, was it through poor planning? Was it through capricious autocracy, Moscow's ignorant administrative elite, or was this a process designed to break the will of Ukraine, designed to crush its independent spirit?
What I think, look, collectivization happened everywhere in the USSR. It was very brutal in Kazakhstan. I'm in Central Asia, where they collectivized the nomadic people, put them into collective farms, not having done anything to help them. And the 1/3 of the Kazakh population died during collectivization in Kazakhstan. They have a very similar history to Ukrainians in that respect. And they also have a very similar history of nuclear stuff, because Kazakhstan is where you had, atomic testing in the air without telling anyone in the surrounding villages that you're going to do that. And we had our Chernobyl. But the Ukrainian specificity of it was that the sequestering of food was way out of disproportion. The political repression and cultural repression was very disproportionate. And in order to exploit that that country, you want to take away its ability to articulate resistance to that exploitation. I mean, people want to determine their own fates. And then, so what you do is you decapitate the potential leadership of that. So you have you have the purges of the party and the purges of the intelligentsia.
And that seems to link up very well with what's probably going to be the last question, and that is the parallel with what Russia's doing now. Because here as well, You see an attempt to decapitate the regime in Kiev. You see extraordinary genocidal destruction of Ukraine's cultural elite in occupied territories, the destruction of schools, artistic centers, cultural heritage. What, in your view, is the parallels between Russia's behavior now in the 21st century and in the 20th, and indeed 19th, 18th?
Yeah, well, it's the same playbook, only it's articulated. It's articulated in a different way, and the difference is that there's Ukrainian resistance. Ukraine had this period of independence, and it's a society that matured in its identity, and Ukraine has shown this unbelievable ability to resist these monsters. But the playbook is the same. They come into schools, and the first thing that they do is they burn Ukrainian language history books and replace them with Russian history books that tell you that you are not Ukrainians and you don't exist. Can you imagine the absurdity? In the 19th century, a Russian official said the Ukrainian language was not, is not, and will never be. So wait a second, either we are or we aren't. The same imperial playbook is being done in a very brutal way today, and I think what everyone is what I many people are surprised with is the absolute brutality of Putin's Russia and how Russian society sunk. How, as the Archbishop of Canterbury said, the gates of hell have been opened up, and the monsters have come out. It is staggering in its dimensions. When you have torture cells for children in Kherson, I mean, you are a very, very sick society. Very, very sick.
And in some ways, having lived in Russia in the 90s for a number of years, it seems to me that the society has degraded, has gone significantly backwards since, those days of relative openness.
Of course. I mean, it's become totalitarian. All the media has been shut. People are arrested. I mean, for God's sake, this is a society where you have a war called the special military operations, but if you call it a war, you'll go to prison. Well, I mean, it's just the monster is out and has to be put back into his cage, defeated.
And very quick one, this time it seems, in my view, that Ukraine is going to win, despite the terrible cost, but it is going to retain its independence and is going to go on to become an extraordinarily creative, robust society, even more so than we see now. Do you have an optimistic view for the future of Ukraine?
Of course, and I think it's an optimism that is rooted in Ukraine's unbelievable ability to resist, and is rooted in faith in how Ukrainian society organizes themselves, how very ordinary people do extraordinary things. So, of course, we have a great president, but we have a great society. We have great workers and farmers and a horizontally organized society. Ukraine is a country where, next to the army, the most highly valued institution in the country are volunteers. By the way, courts and parliament are at the end of the scale.
It's still a work in progress.
It's a work in progress, but the optimism lies in that unbelievable strength of society and its horizontal of its horizontal organization and its basic humanity and kindness. Look at the way Ukrainians respond to animals. I don't know if you've seen these clips of every soldier has a pet. Firemen go out of their. There's a humanity about the whole thing. There's a kindness about it, which is so important and has to be preserved. we can't allow ourselves to be brutalized.
And that's a very positive place to end. I mean, many of the speakers I've spoken to, including some incredible Ukrainian experts, we've discussed many times this idea of the way Ukrainians treat people in life, the way they treat people in death as individuals,
Yes.
whereas Russia collectivizes its living as resources and collectivizes its dead in tasteless monuments.
The latest thing that is pushed on Russian propaganda is the remarkable thing about Russians is how they die. It is staggering. It's now they're not fighting against NATO, they're fighting against Satan. And Putin is the high priest who's going to lead the fight against Satan. And you want to die in the fight against it. It is so profoundly sick that it's hard to describe.
I mean, there's even a military church, I believe, near Moscow, which is extraordinary. Something out of a sort of science fiction or science horror, but it is an absolute perversion of religious values, moral values, everything that you could call good.
The Russian Orthodox Church terms of reference never included moral values.
Well, I'm so
part of the job description.
Well, we could probably uncover that one. That's another can of worms, probably. But I think it's good to end on a relatively optimistic note. I'm incredibly grateful to you for spending so much time in unpacking this terrifying episode of history. And if we have some recommendations, I'll put links to articles in the description. But also, you've mentioned a couple of amazing historians on the topic, like Anne Applebaum and Timothy Schneider. We'll pop some links in the description of this video when it goes live.
Great. Thank you very much.
Slava Ukraini.
Heroyam slava.